Society. We're very happy to have you here with us tonight. And I'm just going to turn it over to Kathy Blackwell, the president of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society.
Nice to see all of you. I'm sure most of you are familiar with our organization. It's a really wonderful community-based, loving our community kind of organization. I've loved being part of it. So we're happy to partner with the libraries, Seattle Public Libraries, to bring you these various stories. And just want to remind you that we have a new exhibit in our main gallery at the Log House Museum. It's the story of how West Seattle was annexed into the city of Seattle. It's a very interesting story full of stories of corruption and gerrymandering. It'll all sound very familiar.
And booze.
And what?
And booze.
And booze. There's a big alarm over saloons. So I hope you'll stop by. You know, we're open Thursday through Sunday, 12 to 4. So we get a lot of visitors from all over the area. It's really interesting. So if you haven't been by, you should come by.
And the music show is still up?
The music show is in the smaller gallery, the Sound Spots. And it's the story of the various places where music was recorded in West Seattle. We've got a great music history here as well. So I'm going to turn the program over now to Rachel Regeline, who is our collections manager and our registrar, and she will introduce our speaker. So thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you so much for attending. Usually, Dorothy, our wonderful committee chair, introduces the speaker, but I've been given that honor tonight. But I do want to quickly recognize Dorothy's commitment to putting on this program for so many years.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to recognize my daughter and granddaughter from Denmark that came to be with their grandpa and me during this rough time.
So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Mike Purdy. He is a presidential historian and author of 100 Presidential Insults, What They Really Thought About Each Other, and What It Means to Us. An expert in presidential history and frequent media commentator on presidential history and politics, Mike runs PresidentialHistory.com as a public resource. His new book, Behind the Political Curtain, exposes how our presidents have dished out cutting and sarcastic insults about other presidents, from the Founding Fathers to the age of Trump. Mike says that he has had a lifelong fascination and interest in the presidents that dates back to more than 50 years to his first presidential memory of John F. Kennedy's inauguration. When he was 8 years old, he memorized all the presidents in order, reciting their names in 10 seconds. Over the years, he's read many biographies and books about the presidents and says he still has many more to read from his library of more than 600 presidential biographies. He's established his website and award-winning presidential history blog to make history accessible. PR Newswire for Journalists, Beyond Bylines, selected his blog as their top presidential blogs we love last year. He lives in Seattle and is a frequent commentator on presidential history and politics for national and international media outlets, including CNN, The Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Today.com, Reuters, Bloomberg BNA, The Huffington Post, and BBC. He is also a regular opinion contributor to TheHill.com. Please help me welcome Mike Purdy to his first appearance on Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories.
Well, good evening. Great to be here with you guys. So Rachel was mentioning about my media interviews. I had one of the more unusual ones just last night. So I was traveling and I was in Houston, and CTV, which is Canadian television, had contacted me and said, can you do a live FaceTime interview with us? I said, well, I'm traveling, I don't know how to do this. And they really wanted me to do it and to comment on the impeachment hearings that were held yesterday. So I found a deserted gate at the Houston airport. I mean, really, there's nobody there. And I actually checked the arrival and departures, and there was nobody who was going to be showing up there. And so I kind of set up my iPhone on, the desk where they check people in, and pulled the chair over, and it worked. So Anyway, so you all should have a copy in front of you. You can see the book cover on the one side. And on the other side is something I wrote recently for a website that's got a focus on the presidents, and they were kind of a contest they were doing on talking about the value of teaching history. And so I just replicated what I wrote about the value of teaching history, and you can read that at your leisure. So what I want to do tonight is share with you a little bit about where this book came from, and talk about, go through the book and tell you some stories from it, and then I want to have time for questions and comments and conversation as well. So one of the things that I've tried to do in the book is to talk about the fact that not only these 44 men who have served as president, and we've only had 44. You remember Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms, so he's our 22nd and our 24th president. So we've only had 44 men, even though we say Trump is our 45th president. But these 44 men have said some really nasty things about each other over time, either in writing or in letters or in diaries, a lot of ways that they've done it. We'll talk about more of that later on. So the book is, I like to describe it as both laugh aloud funny, but it's also really sad and shocking that they would do this. And then what I tried to talk about in the introduction is the importance of trying to build a more civil society, so we're not personally demonizing people's humanity and their patriotism. And so we'll kind of talk about all that as we go through the evening. So, I've titled the talk that words matter, because I think what we say and how we say it really does make a difference, for good or bad. So some people have asked me, how long it took me to write the book. Well, there's kind of 2 answers to that. One is that about 30 years, because about 30 years ago I started noticing from my reading of presidential biographies, I go, these guys knew each other. They had relationships with each other. And I started identifying quotes that they would say about each other. And sometimes those quotes were really very nice, and sometimes they were nasty, and you get the nasty ones here. Because I thought, given the times that we live in, I think this is a very timely book, and it's a way to laugh, have a good time, but hopefully to think more seriously about how do we create a more civil society. One of the quotes that I love, and you may have heard it about presidents being nice to each other. There's the occasion when John F. Kennedy was president, and it's in the East Room of the White House, and he's entertaining Nobel Prize winners. And Kennedy says, at that meeting, he says, never before has so much intelligence been gathered together in the White House in a single place, except perhaps when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone. So it's a very nice quote about Jefferson. So when I was 8 years old, I was really into the presidents. I still am. And my dad bought me the U.S. Department of Treasury engravings of each of the presidents. And of course, at that time, there were only 35, only going up to Kennedy. And I posted them on my bedroom wall in order, and that's what I memorized in order. And yes, I can still say them in 10 seconds, but only up through Kennedy. And then after that, I slowed down because I have to start thinking. But it's all muscle memory up to Kennedy. So a quick quiz here. So up in the upper left, we have George Washington. And upper right, we have Thomas Jefferson. And lower right, we have Teddy Roosevelt. And now you get a prize if you can do this one. Lower left.
Franklin Pierce.
Very good! Franklin Pierce. Yeah. Yeah, that's Franklin Pierce. And so, you know, when I was a kid, I would go to the school library and I would read all the biographies of the presidents that they had, and I had a lot in my collection as well. This is actually a book, this Childhood of Famous American series that I read a lot of them. This is a book about Lincoln, and I still have it after many, many years. Haven't read it for a while, but. So one of the things that I learned in writing the book is that what these presidents said about one another, it's been going on since the beginning. So, you know, our founding fathers, they were not shy about saying things about each other. So, illiterate, unlearned, and unread. Who was that said about, and who said it? Any ideas? Any guesses?
About Lincoln.
No, it's not about Lincoln. No.
Andrew Jackson?
No, well, that would be appropriate, but, and other people said similar things about Jackson, but no, this was said by John Adams about George Washington. Yeah. So, just this was in a private letter that he wrote to Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and that's what he wrote about Washington. A little bit more, he said that Washington was not a scholar is certain, that he was too illiterate, unread, unlearned, unread for his station and reputation is equally past dispute. So this is what he's saying. So Adams is, you know, Washington's vice president. But this was said when he was, when Adams was a former president and Washington was already dead. Okay. Distrustful, obstinate, excessively vain. Any ideas?
John Adams.
Said about John Adams?
Yeah.
Yes.
But it could have been anybody.
And so take a guess who said it?
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson said it about Adams. So this was one of the really interesting quotes. One of the things that I tried to do in the book is to make sure that every quote that I included was, I could document it. I could document the primary source for it. So I did a lot of research on it. I've included in the back all of the notes where I got the quotes from. And, you know, unfortunately, there were some quotes that I had to leave out. You know, Theodore Roosevelt is reputed to have said that William Howard Taft had the brains of a guinea pig. And I love the quote, it's very memorable. But I couldn't find the original source for it, so I had to leave that out of the book. But so I tried to document where things came from. So I had run across this quote about distrustful, obstinate, excessively vain in a lot of different sources. And then I started digging back to try to find out where it really came from. I was having the hardest time. Finally, I found one book that had a footnote on it. I thought, great. So I found that other book, and I went to that, and they had a footnote of where they got it from. So I did this 2 or 3 times, and I finally got to the source. The only problem was when I got to the source, it was in French. And I don't read French. So I took it to my daughter who reads French. I said, what does this say? And she confirmed that. And so how does a quote that's in French show up in this kind of a book? So what happened is Jefferson was having a conversation with the French General Counsel, who then recounted that conversation with another Frenchman. And then it got documented, and that's how we have it. But the interesting thing is that you've got Adams at the time of this was just, March, April, May, June. This was 3 months after Washington and, after Jefferson and Adams, getting confused here, hold on just a second. Right, after Adams was elected president and Jefferson was elected vice president, 3 months after their inauguration, this is what Jefferson is saying about his vice president. Not to be undone just a few weeks later.
Adams was saying it, or Jefferson?
This is Jefferson saying it about Adams. But a few weeks
Adams wasn't Jefferson's vice president.
Jefferson was Adams.
Did I say that wrong? So Jefferson was vice president to Adams.
So he was saying it about his president.
Yes, right, right. And then a few weeks later, Adams says about Jefferson, he talks about Jefferson being weak, confused, uninformed, and ignorant. So they were off to a great start as president and vice president. A mere tool in the hands of the French government. Any ideas who said that or wrote that and who they said it about? Now, this is a really interesting one. This is about James Monroe, and it's a note by George Washington. And so Washington was really very proper and everything, but Washington had recalled Monroe from France as French ambassador and U.S. ambassador to France, and Monroe was a little bit ticked off by that, so he wrote a book kind of justifying all of his actions in France. Washington got a copy of the book, and he was livid reading it, so he writes in the margin of the book at one point that Monroe is a mere tool in the hands of the French government. So that's where we get that from. So, you know, we've always had this poisonous politics. It's always been around. And I think one of the big differences between today and in the past is that things today are much more public. So we live in the day of Twitter, and somebody could just instantaneously write something and it's out there for millions of people. Whereas in the past, most of these quotes came about through a letter or a diary or recounting a private conversation. So things have escalated clearly in our day right now. I think the other thing that's obvious is that today things are much more unfiltered. There's not really any pretense of being civil, and we've got things today that are much more frequent. In the past, you had these things be, you know, not as pervasive as what we have today. So that's one of the big changes. So besides the fact that this has been around forever, these insults, the other thing that I learned is about the very humanity of these 44 men who have served as president. So Thomas Jefferson was petrified of public speaking. He didn't like getting in front of a group. He would rather sit down and write, and he was an excellent writer, obviously. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, but was very scared of public speaking. Abraham Lincoln suffered from chronic depression for most of his life, and yet he was able to rise above that somehow, and he is, you know, rated by most people as our greatest president. Who's this?
William Howard Taft.
William Howard Taft. So what's Taft's stress in life? Taft did not want to be president. His wife wanted him to be president. And seriously, so when Taft's wife, Nellie, was a 17-year-old teenager, her father took her to the White House for a reception. Rutherford Hayes was president. And he took her to this reception at the White House, and she was just awed by the glamour of the White House. And so she resolved then and there as a 17-year-old, and she said that she would never marry a man who didn't have the potential to become president. And so all Taft wanted to do was to be a judge. And in fact, you know, when Taft was Governor General of the Philippines under McKinley and then Theodore Roosevelt, 3 times there were openings on the U.S. Supreme Court. And 3 times Roosevelt offered him a position on the Supreme Court. And 3 times he turned Roosevelt down. Variety of reasons. Partially because he said there's still, undone work in the Philippines, but in large measure, his wife didn't want to see him get buttonholed onto the court because then he couldn't become president. That was her lifelong dream. Okay? And but Roosevelt ends up, basically anointing Taft to be his successor. Nellie Taft was delighted with this because that's what she wanted. But for Taft, the presidency was for Taft, the presidency was incredibly stressful. And so how did he manage the stress? He ate, and he ate, and he ate. So when he left the White House, he tipped the scales at 340 pounds. Within 1 year after he left the White House, he had lost 70 pounds. So this was how he dealt with this. We have to remember that these men, we kind of elevate them up in our minds, but they were very, very human, and they all had different issues. We talked earlier about Franklin Pierce. We saw his picture. So Pierce started his presidency kind of under an emotional cloud. Because a couple months before he was inaugurated, Pierce and his wife and their 11-year-old son were on a train. The train crashed. And Pierce and his wife saw their 11-year-old son killed in front of their eyes. Just tragic. And that set them both into a deep depression. Pierce began to drink. This was tough. This was a tough way to begin, a very hard job. The presidency has become a harder job over time, but still, even back then, there's a lot of issues that the president was dealing with. So very human. We all know what it's like to deal with family members who are ill or who've passed away, and these hit us at our point of humanity. And it hits these presidents too. Who's this?
Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson. So Wilson, when he was president, his wife, Ellen, died in the White House. And that put him into a depression. And so the presidency is becoming much more important, and this was really tough, but yet, shortly after that, Wilson meets Edith Bowling Galt, a widow, and they court and they date, and he marries her. But again, just think about what it's like to have the burdens of the presidency and at the same time be dealing with some of these tragedies. Who's this guy? Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. You've heard the story perhaps about Silent Cal. He didn't talk a lot. And I think it's both because of his personality, but there's also some things about his background that I'll tell you about in a second. But one of the things about Coolidge is there's the story that Coolidge is at a dinner party, and a woman sits down next to him, and she turns to the president and says, "I made a bet with my friend that I could get you to say more than 2 words." Coolidge turns to her and says, "You lose." So part of it is personality, but one of the things that happened to Coolidge during his presidency is his 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., is playing tennis on the White House lawn, and his toe gets infected. And a week later, his teenage son was dead. Coolidge wrote later, after the presidency, he says that when his son died, that the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. And so this sunk him into a depression, and this is probably part of why he wasn't very talkative, but he already had the predisposition to not being a big talker. So one of the other things that I learned about the presidents in doing this book is that they ended up, sometimes what they said about each other really fractured good friendships. So you can take the example of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So they met in Philadelphia in 1775 for the Second Continental Congress, which was drafting the Declaration of Independence. They were good friends, they were collaborators, they're both on the same committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, and Adams says, you know, you should write it. Jefferson, you're a much better writer. Throughout his life, though, Adams always was a little bit irritated by the fact that Jefferson got all the credit for that. But they were good friends. They both go to Europe as representing the United States. Their families are there. Their families are good friends. They know each other. And then the election comes around. The election of 1800, they're running against each other. And of course, Jefferson wins that election, but they're of different political parties. They have different political persuasions, and their friendship gets shattered by that. So then after their presidencies, many years later, Adams writes a letter to Jefferson. So they hadn't had much contact. But he writes a letter, and one of the things he says in that letter, he says, you and I ought not to die until we have explained ourselves to each other. You and I ought not to die before we've explained ourselves to each other. And I love that terminology, explaining ourselves to each other. And how can that serve as a model for us? That began a series of correspondence of about 13 years that Adams and Jefferson corresponded with one another. And of course, famously, they both died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, which was the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams is dying and says Thomas Jefferson still survives, not knowing that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. So it can really fracture relationships. There's the story of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who the 1912 election became a tragic breaking of their friendship. And I would actually say that before 2016, that the 1912 presidential election was the most vicious one we have ever had. So it was a three-way race, so the incumbent, Taft, is trying to get reelected. Theodore Roosevelt has been denied the Republican nomination, so he bolts and creates his own third party, the Bull Moose, or the Progressive Party, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. Vicious, vicious campaign, some of the things that they said about one another. But the thing is to remember that Roosevelt and Taft, in their 30s, were both in Washington, D.C. in different positions, and they were best of buddies. They lived in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C. They walked together to work. They had lunch together. And then, when they both left D.C. and went on to other jobs, they each helped one another on getting different positions, and they were there for each other. And then you have this tragic break point in their relationship in 1912. Taft fought back because Roosevelt was more the aggressor on this, and Roosevelt had a very sharp tongue, and he could say some pretty interesting things. I mean, he called Woodrow Wilson in that campaign, he called him a Byzantine logothete. So when you don't know what to say to somebody, you know, you say they're a Byzantine logothete. Actually, in the book, I have a glossary for things like this. What is a Byzantine logo theme? So you can read about it in the glossary. But so during the campaign, this really crushed Taft, that this friendship was disintegrating. At one point, there's a, Taft is on a train. Train's parked, and a reporter finds Taft on the train. And Taft is crying. This is the President of the United States. He's crying. And he says, Theodore was my best friend. And this just totally crushed him. And then, you know, Roosevelt died first. There was never a real reconciliation between these men. There were a few times after their presidencies, after 1912, that they got together, but it was awkward after what they had said. And but at Theodore Roosevelt's funeral, Taft was there, and he lingered after everybody had left the burial site, and he's got tears in his eyes. And this was a tragic thing that happened. So why is it that not just back then, but especially now, why is it that we have this death of civility? Why is it that we can't treat one another better? So a number of months ago, I was on an Alaska Airlines flight, and I was chatting with the flight attendant, and I said, so how long have you been a flight attendant? She said, 32 years. And I said, wow, that's a long time. So you must have seen a lot of changes over time. So tell me, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen? And she said, you know, in the last 6 or 7 years, people have just gotten more mean. They've gotten more mean. So it's this overall trend that's infecting us as a society. We've got members of Congress, members of the Senate, members of the House, who have been friends for a long time. They're of different political parties, and they're not talking to each other. Okay? Because partisan politics is trumping relationships. We have marriages and families that are being shattered because of tensions politically. So Thanksgiving is coming up. So for many people, that's going to be a very awkward time. Okay? So there's a lot of incendiary rhetoric going on. So just a few things. These are obviously dated. We could check our phones right now. We could find the latest what's being said. Okay. You know, Cher said that Trump was an ignorant thug. Trump says that Bernie Sanders is crazy Bernie. Nancy Pelosi calls Trump a freak. And of course, Trump calls Hillary Clinton crooked Hillary. So, you know, this is not any way to run a railroad. This is not any way to manage government by 8th grade name calling and talks like that. But that's the environment that we unfortunately live in today. So I want to think a little bit about what causes some of this lack of civility. Why is this going on? So I think there's multiple answers to that question. I think one of the big things is that people are afraid. They're afraid of changes that they're seeing in society that are impacting them. So they're afraid of job loss. And the job loss might be coming because technology is eliminating their job. Retail workers, you get self-checkout now, and that's going to increase. You get truck drivers. There's going to be self-driving trucks. And how do we as a society manage these kinds of things? But there's fear about these. People are worried about getting a good education, and how are they going to pay for it? So there's a lot of fear and there's anger at changes that are going on. I think another reason, or set of reasons for this lack of civility is the fact that people are seeing that we live in a more diverse country than we did in the 1950s. It's much different. People look different. People worship differently. People speak different languages. And there's a certain segment of the American population that looks at that and is afraid. And so part of this is a lashing out then at that because all of these differences. So one of the really interesting things, I don't know if you can read it, I'll try to point it out. This comes from, the chart comes from the Pew Research Center. And so it starts 1965, and it goes to 1975, 85, 95, and it goes all the way up to 2065 as a projection. And so this big block down here is the percentage of the population that is white. And so in 1965, it's, what, about 85%. And then you go to the projections, and that's going to be somewhere probably under 60% is going to be white. And so what's happening? Well, you can see the biggest change is this block right here. The Hispanic population is a very small percentage in 1965, and it's really projected to grow. Asian population is growing. The black population, which is this line here, is relatively stable. But these are big changes in our society, and people are seeing that and they're saying they don't like that. And so they lash out at people who are different. I think the lack of civility is also caused by what I would call the loss of objective truth, where you get to create truth. There is no objective truth. And you can create it really easily. Just get out your phone right now, go onto Twitter, and blast away. So you get to say what it is you think is true. And that is becoming pervasive in our society. So we're losing kind of institutional organs like the media, which has become so niche-oriented that people listen to the media that supports their own opinion. So I think we've got, political purity. Political purity ends up becoming more important than pragmatism, getting things done, and relationships with people. And that's all that we end up seeing. And this is on both sides of the aisle. So you get the Tea Party movement on the conservative Republican side. You have the progressive movement that we're seeing played out right now as Democrats are vying for the Democratic nomination. So you get these two extremes, and yet governing is all about how do we manage for everybody, not just the extremes. I think there's also this sense where we don't take the time to really understand the hopes and the fears. We talked about some of the fears. Understand the hopes and the fears of other people. How do we do that? And then finally, I think another reason is before the age of easy airline traveling, Congress would meet 5 days a week. Their families, congressmen, congresswomen, senators, their families lived in Washington, D.C. with them. Their families socialized with one another. They socialized with one another, people of different political parties. They knew each other as people, not just as the enemy, okay? But with transportation improvements, what we have now is Congress meets 3 days a week. Families don't live in D.C. anymore. And so congressmen, senators, after those 3 days of meetings, they go back to their district, they go back to their state. They don't know one another as people anymore. So I think this is a contributing factor to the breakdown of civility in Congress. George H.W. Bush, I was actually at his museum and library yesterday, just north of Houston. So one of the things that Bush said in his inaugural address, he called for a kinder, gentler nation. And so I often have wondered, what would that look like if we had a kinder, gentler nation? How would we do that? And part of it, I think, is there a way that we can agree on high-level objectives and goals? Can we all agree that we love this country? Can we all agree that people in this country shouldn't be starving? That they shouldn't be living on the streets? That they shouldn't be dying because they don't have adequate health care? Can we agree on some basic humane kinds of things? Let's agree on that. And then let's have a vigorous but civil conversation or debate about what are the best policies to implement that, but without, demonizing one another. So this requires that we listen carefully to each other, that we listen to people's hopes and fears, but we try to understand and we try to come to an agreement on the basic things about goals that we all share in common. Last December, the president of the state of Maine Senate did something utterly shocking. The president of the Senate has the right to decide where members sit on the floor of the Senate. And he decreed that Democrats and Republicans would sit next to each other. Rather than Democrats over here and Republicans over here, get to know them as people. I think Congress could take a cue from that. So here's what he said. He said, the people of Maine sent us here to solve a host of complex problems that interfere with their ability to lead happy, healthy, and successful lives. By focusing on the values and goals that unite us, we will be more likely to move the needle on critical issues. So.
And did it work?
Yeah, there's some good things going on there in terms of them starting to see one another as people. Yeah. So I want to just give you a quick outline of the book and a couple other comments about things from the book. So the introduction talks about this, the fact the insults have been around forever, the humanity of the presidents. It tells some other stories about broken friendships, also heartwarming reconciliations besides Adams and Jefferson, and then it talks about the civility issue. And then I talked about the glossary, and then at the end of the book, what I did is I took a number of the quotes. I took all the quotes and I picked out the adjectives from the quotes, and I put them in alphabetical order. And then I have a column saying who's it about and who said it. So I'm going to just see how many pages does this go on for. This goes on for 4 pages. So I'm going to just rattle off the first page of these adjectives. Just give you a flavor. Autocratic, backbone of an angleworm, barbarian, barefaced liar, bewildered, bigoted partisan, bozo, brute with women, bungalow mind, Byzantine logothete, calculating bastard, clownish, coarse, cold as ice, cold-blooded, coldest man, complete fizzle, confused, congenital liar, dangerous agitator, demagogue, dangerous man, dictatorial, diffident little man, dirty. It's just a quick flavor. I mean, this is just a pretty shocking list, what these guys said about each other. And then I've got another chart after that that talks about who spoke things or wrote things, and then who did they say it about. So for instance, the only insult that is in the book that comes from Washington's pen is this one about Monroe, that he's a mere tool in the hands of the French government. You know, Adams talked about Washington and Jefferson, Jefferson talked about Washington, Adams, Madison, and Jackson, and it goes on, and you can see. So actually, interestingly, on the cover, partially selected these men for the cover based on, you know, how many times they insulted others. So Truman had a foul mouth and said things. Theodore Roosevelt definitely did. Nixon said a lot, Kennedy did, and of course Trump says a lot as well, tweets a lot. And then there's also a chart where I talk about the source of the insults. So of the 101 insults, where did they come from? You know, what's private versus what's public? How many were private versus public? And then the notes at the end. So I want to just end with the last sentence of the introduction. So may we collectively strive to value relationships over political dogma, encourage deep reconciliation out of our fractured friendships, and reset our political discourse from one of rancor to respect. So that's the hope. It's a tough road. We're in a difficult period in our nation's history. So it remains to be seen how this all plays out over time. So I would be glad to try to answer any questions that you might have or comments that you might have. Perfect.
I'd like to hear the list of the presidents.
Oh, you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
10 seconds.
Well, okay, up to Kennedy I can do it. Then I'm going to really slow down. I might even mess up after that. You have to take a drink of water.
And you might have to stand shorter, like you were when you were 8.
That's right, I'm a little 8-year-old kid. Okay, here we go. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump.